All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to our Epistemic Injustice Workshop. For our first talk today, we'll be listening to Olerato, who will tell us about imposter syndrome and epistemic injustice. I don't know, those online, can you hear us clearly? Speaker, can those online hear us clearly?
Can they hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right.
All right. Good morning, everyone. As you said, my name is Olerato, and I am currently a PhD candidate and lecturer at the University of Cape Town, philosophy. So I'd like to obviously thank Veli and her team for organizing this wonderful conference. Today, I'll be speaking on imposter syndrome, or the imposter phenomenon more widely used, focusing particularly on how our current understanding of imposter syndrome can be the cause of epistemic injustice, and also then after developing an account of imposter syndrome, which sees it as produced and maintained by epistemic injustice in epistemic communities and environments. So I'm going to just kind of go straight ahead and ask ourselves clarify what is imposter syndrome. And here I want to start us off with the dominant conception of imposterism, which is another way I'm going to use this term. This is the psychological conception, and psychological in the sense that it was developed by psychologists Pauline Clance and Suzanne Eames, who are credited for coining the term imposter syndrome, and it is primarily their understanding, which we find to be the most dominant way of understanding imposter syndrome today. So the psychological conception of imposterism has two dimensions. It has a doxastic dimension and an affective dimension. So just to start with the doxastic dimension, we can understand imposter syndrome to involve situations where successful and capable people believe that they are inadequate qua their capacity as epistemic agents, despite having evidence to the contrary. So there's this idea that you, as a successful individual, have these emergent feelings that you are and beliefs that you are inadequate, despite actually having evidence that shows that you aren't inadequate, and you essentially ignore that evidence. These individuals see themselves as frauds and believe that they do not belong to an epistemic environment or space. These individuals are considered to be biased against evidence in favor of their abilities, in that they overdetermine evidence that may indicate failure as evidence that they are not good enough, for example. And these individuals are also painted as tending to explain away their success. So they tend to explain away their success by attributing it to luck, hard work, perhaps that they successfully deceived people around them, or that others are just being sympathetic when they say that they are good enough to be in a space. So in terms of the affective dimension, we see that imposter syndrome induces feelings of fear, anxiety, and a lack of confidence in one's own abilities. And also that it concerns a relation to how one relates to their own accomplishments and how they feel about themselves in their capacity as epistemic agents. So this conception of the psychological conception has been somewhat widely, it's quite, well, our analysis of imposter syndrome in philosophy is quite new, and this can be seen in the work of Stephen Gatsby and Catherine Hawley, who has written multiple papers on this. And essentially, what I find with the philosophical conceptions is that they somewhat take in the dominant conception and try to systematize it philosophically. So they somewhat assume a lot of the things that we see in the in the psychological conception. But essentially, again, with Stephen Gatsby's conception, we see again that he has a view of imposter syndrome as an unwarranted belief as well as caused by an unwarranted belief that you are inadequate, that comes as a result of treating evidence biasly, right? So there's this idea that the people who experience themselves as imposters have evidence that is clearly available to them that they willfully ignore. They ignore as a result of some biased treatment of evidence and explain away, as I said earlier. So I'm not going to go too much into the other philosophical conceptions, but I think I just wanted to show that this conception, the psychological conception, is quite widely accepted within the philosophical literature, and with the exception, of course, of Catherine Hawley, who just at least gives us a narrow conception of imposter syndrome and also gives us a wider, broader view. But in the broader view, she just gives us an invitation to maybe understand imposter syndrome differently by saying that, well, we might need to leave open room for the possibility that imposterism can result from justified belief in relation to the environment that one is in. We might also want to leave the possibility open that someone can get feedback from the environment that's mixed enough to make them doubt their abilities. So I want you to maybe keep this broader conception in mind, just park it at the back of your minds, because I think it's going to be quite relevant to my presentation later. So what you've seen from my exploration of the psychological conception of imposterism, and just briefly on Gatsby's self-deception account, are the following key features that I seek to problematize and eventually remedy in my ameliorative work on the imposter syndrome concept. So first, we see that we get a primarily psychologized understanding of imposter syndrome, which centers the agent and their cognitive processes as the only things we need to really look at if we were to understand imposter syndrome. Secondly, it seems that it is treated as sufficient to only focus on the irrationalities displayed by the agent experiencing imposter syndrome. This is given primarily by the sole emphasis on biased treatment of evidence and dysfunctional belief formation processes of the agent. And then thirdly, there is a significant implication that imposter syndrome is something the agent inflicts on themselves. It is treated more generally as an issue of self-perception, unwarranted lack of confidence in one's own abilities, and the idea that one just is self-deceptively ignoring evidence and treating it biasly. And finally, there is an insistence on showing that this imposterism to be based on an unwarranted belief, particularly because the literature maintains that the agent has at least clear evidence contrary to their belief that they are inadequate, which is available to them. Before proceeding, I think I want to draw a more general observation, just so I can make the points that I'm going to make later, which is the fact that imposterism can be understood as an epistemic phenomenon in many ways. It concerns, of course, the individual in the capacity as a knower or being in the know within a particular environment, and whether they perceive themselves as knowers, at least in the psychological conception. It concerns one's status again as a justified knower, right? I think that's one of the contestations about, are you justified in feeling like an imposter? So that seems to be relevant. In addition, there's also talk of biases and dysfunctional belief formation processes. That is, of course, in parallel with talk of perhaps these individuals having epistemic biases that they need to work on, as the psychological conception would probably say. And more importantly, I want to say that imposter syndrome can also be understood at present as involving how one believes and feels themselves to be part of an epistemic community, particularly whether they believe themselves to be epistemic peers. I'm happy to go through these terms later on. Under the current conception of imposter syndrome, one unwarrantedly holds the false belief that they are not epistemic peers, because they have evidence available to them which indicates to them that they are epistemic peers, but choose to ignore it or downplay it in some other way. Having shown how imposter syndrome can be an epistemic phenomenon, I want to proceed by giving us a picture of how imposter syndrome is experienced by marginalized individuals, with the hopes of perhaps teasing out the saliences and the tensions between the marginalized experience and the psychological conception of imposter syndrome. So to do so, I will be focusing on two studies on imposter syndrome that by Copley and McGee and their teams. So these are separate studies. However, these studies essentially found, or the McGee study, found that only 5.3% of the Black students in an engineering department that were interviewed for this imposter syndrome study self-attributed their experiences of imposterism, while a staggering 94% of participants attributed their feelings of not belonging to structural racism and interactions which position them as not belonging. McGee further finds that Black students were one of the most likely to question their ability in academia. In particular, the study claimed that Black students viewed themselves as imposters and struggle to internalize their success in racially hostile environments. From this alone, and I'm happy to expand on this further, we see that marginalized people experience imposterism differently from how it's been described by the dominant psychological literature, especially within historically Western and patriarchal epistemic communities. Their experience of imposterism seems to be inextricably linked to their experiences of structural and interactive prejudices in their epistemic communities. In particular, we see that the epistemic communities and environments that Black students are a part of in this case are mired by a very present history of structural and interactive racism that produces a particular kind of imposter syndrome that is tied to their embodiment as marginalized persons. Perhaps Charles Mills might be helpful in understanding why this imposterism could be produced by the epistemic community and environment one belongs to, or a Black person belongs to in this instance. In his conception of the racial contract, he understands the contract to position European privileged men as generic prototype knowers and categorizes the non-European people or non-white people as incapable of intellectual achievement and progress. Taking for granted the extent to which the racial contract is a real phenomenon, which I believe it is, I take these conditions of the racial contract to be prevalent in many epistemic spaces which have been touched by the hand of coloniality and or Western imperialism. As such institutions have ingrained in them such epistemic conditions which people from marginalized racial groups encounter acutely or passively. I find that an acute awareness of the pervasiveness of the racial contract or structural racism can potentially cause one to at least understand why they feel like an imposter in a space. But what I find more dangerous is the situation where one is not aware of the pervasiveness of the racial contract, for example, and how it manifests in the praxis and the very business of the epistemic community, and how this can be taken to end up, can put a person in a position where they end up believing that they are inadequate or do not belong to an epistemic space while seeing themselves as a problem. So essentially, if my intuitions are correct here, what we see emerge is the beginning of a very different picture of imposterism, one where the belief is not merely self-induced, but is externally brought about by the conditions of the epistemic community you find, or a Black person in this instance would find themselves in. We see a case where imposterism can potentially be based on justified belief as well, particularly when taking into account the evidence that an epistemic community governed by the conditions of the racial contract in this instance can produce implicitly or explicitly positions that position a Black person as a non-knower in the same epistemic community. So now that we have just explored a case where imposter syndrome can be understood to be induced by experiences of structural and interactive injustices in one's epistemic community, we get a picture of imposterism, which is in a sense justified and not merely a product of self-deception, in that it is produced by having evidence of or having the experience of being treated as an imposter in the epistemic environment one is in. So what we are seeing here is the emergence of a conception which is not captured by the dominant conception of psychological narratives, rather, on what imposterism is. The psychological conception, of course, tells us little to nothing about how our beliefs in our imposterism can sometimes be warranted, and how they can also be induced by the conditions of the epistemic environment and community one is a part of. There is a disjuncture between the psychological conception of imposterism and the experience of imposterism by marginalized persons, which makes the sole use of the psychological conception particularly prone to inflicting hermeneutical injustice against marginalized people who experience imposterism differently. Just go a bit deeper into that. Well, without repeating too much on the nature of hermeneutical injustice, I want to focus more on Jose Medina's point about what is important in our talk about hermeneutical injustice, as is relevant to the dominance of the psychological conception of imposterism in this instance. He claims that when it comes to hermeneutical harms and injustice, the question is not simply whether or not the expressive and interpretive resources available for meaning making and meaning sharing are available, but how these resources are used, by whom, and in what way. So I want to focus a bit more on the latter part of that statement. First, there is a sense in which the use and pervasiveness of the psychological conception to understand and articulate experiences of imposterism does more to rob marginalized groups from the ability to make meaning of their particular experiences of imposterism as tied to their experience of structural and interactive injustices. Secondly, there is a sense in which the psychological conception and its use can serve to undermine the experiences of imposterism more generally, and can be the subject of ineffective measures of combating imposter syndrome, as seen in typical unhelpful self-help kind of responses to the issue of like, yeah, you should just go and have more confidence in yourself. I think that the psychological conception really implies these kind of solutions. But what I really want to focus on is how the psychological conception essentially harms the marginalized individual by epistemically gaslighting this individual. So to make someone who experiences a structural and interactively induced imposterism only comprehend their experience through the psychologized lens is to epistemically gaslight that individual. So let me just go a bit further into what this is. So epistemic gaslighting, I'm using the term as developed by Andrew Spear, and it's a situation where one or epistemic agent or institution in this instance, so I take a more structural understanding of epistemic gaslighting, makes a tacit claim to epistemic superiority and causes the person being gaslighted to lose trust in their ability to interpret the experience as an independent locus of experience, thought, and judgment. In this instance, I contend that we can expand our understanding of epistemic gaslighting to include the use and prevalence of certain concepts as playing a role in the gaslighting. Here, I consider the dominance of a particular concept to create conditions where the use of that concept is understood as indicative of its epistemic superiority in understanding that phenomenon. It is here that the person who understands their experiences differently from the dominant understanding loses trust in their ability to understand their own experience, precisely because it does not match up to how the experience has been dominantly conceptualized. It creates conditions where the available epistemic resource pushes them to understand, or compels them rather to understand, the phenomena differently from how they otherwise experience it. So as such, it seems that the use of the psychological conception creates conditions where minorities are pushed by the prevailing understanding of imposterism to refrain from interpreting imposterism in the structurally violent way that they actually experience it. So the epistemic harms here is that essentially the use of this, almost the prevalence and the use of the psychological conception robs the marginalized of tools from understanding their own experience of imposterism, and essentially diminishes their self-trust in their ability to interpret their own experience in a way that matches to how they experience it and not how the concept says they're experiencing it. So taking the use of the psychological conception to inflict hermeneutical injustice on the marginalized motivates a call and need to ameliorate our understanding of imposter syndrome. As you may be aware, Sally Hassanger speaks of ameliorating a concept as a process where one thinks critically about how the concepts we have available to us are used, and in particular reference to how the concepts that we use can be conceptualized in a way that they can further certain ends. So in ameliorating the conception of imposterism, we need to have one that best facilitates ending imposterism for everyone. We also need a conception that makes those who are in fact epistemic peers in a community feel valued and treated as such. As Catherine Hawley notes again, we want to have a conception that helps with overcoming the hermeneutical barriers caused by the prominent conception of imposterism. As such, there seems to be a need for a conception of imposterism, which is better positioned to end imposterism for marginalized individuals as well. So I propose the following conception of imposterism as an additional ameliorated conception of imposterism, which better encapsulates the experience of imposterism by marginalized groups. So this is what I have on the right side of my slide. I'll just read it quickly. So I say that imposterism is a product of structural and interactive epistemic gaslighting, where continuous encounters with structural injustices produce epistemic affected conditions in capable epistemic agents, leading them to doubt their standing as epistemic peers. When the doubt is successfully induced by the structural and interactive injustices, the epistemic agent is compelled to bypass their autonomous belief formation processes about their capabilities and status as epistemic peers, leading them to believe that they might not actually belong to the epistemic community that they are in, whilst in fact being members in good standing. The experience of imposterism is justified on the part of the agent from the prejudicial evidence produced by the continuous encounters with epistemic injustice, creating a situation where the fake evidence, which I'll explain shortly, produced by covert epistemic injustice is difficult to distinguish from real evidence against their abilities. So here, as a social ontologist, I can't help myself but use explanatory tales to kind of explain what a phenomena is. So I essentially give you a picture of how we can better understand what imposterism is and how it comes about and how it's maintained. So I think that it starts from the prevalence of structural and interactive epistemic injustice in epistemic communities, and the fact that this epistemic injustice produces fake evidence which implicates one's status as an epistemic peer and seeks to epistemically gaslight that individual structurally anyway, or interactively. And then the structural and interactive epistemic gaslighting succeeds precisely because of the indiscernibility between what is real and what is fake evidence against one's status as an epistemic peer. And it is this success of the epistemic gaslighting which would be surmountable to saying that the environment has, or the epistemic environment called community, has induced imposter syndrome in the individual, which would essentially explain why that individual is unable to internalize their success, has anxieties, believes in their own inadequacy, and so forth. By way of example, I want to look at how testimonial injustice can produce and maintain imposter syndrome. But before continuing, I should say that I'm not committing to saying that imposter syndrome is only a product of testimonial injustice. I'm prepared to accept that it can be a product of hermeneutical injustice and also concern know-how in some senses. However, for the sake of brevity and scope, I will focus only on the structural and transactional testimonial injustice to use Jeremy Wanderer's conception of the varieties of epistemic injustice and how that can bring about imposter syndrome. So Jeremy Wanderer gives us two, broader conceptions of testimonial injustice, which is the transactional testimonial injustice and the structural testimonial injustice. So with the transactional testimonial injustice, this is a kind of injustice where self-conscious interpersonal transactions within the social practice of testimony are governed by, which are of course governed by a certain order of justice in the epistemic community, and that epistemic order of justice has actually been breached. So I should have said it better. But here, the essential epistemic harm is that the epistemic agent is treated unfairly, discriminated against, unfairly treated as an epistemic inferior in testimonial exchange. So there's a broader conception here which kind of goes beyond the talk of credibility deficits in one way or another. And then it has the structural testimonial injustice, which concerns structural inequities and prejudices, leading to diminished possibilities in fair and adequate participation in the social space of testimony. And here again, we can draw back to Mill's racial contract example and how the racial contract brings about the structural injustices that have inextricable links to the epistemic practices, relations, and status quo of the epistemic community. The next key step in articulating the explanatory tale of the emergence and maintenance of imposterism in marginalized people are as follows. First, it is to accept that structural injustices can be pervasive and determinative of the very epistemic practice, of the very business of doing epistemic work in the epistemic community. In addition, it is to establish that the very pervasiveness and determinative power of the structural injustice in shaping the epistemic community is indicative of the covertness of structural injustice, in that it only manifests in what appears as epistemically relevant claims about that particular agent. So let's take the example of a Black woman who is an actual epistemic peer, so they are not an actual imposter. And this individual has her testimony undermined and dismissed continuously, or is made to feel that her epistemic contributions are not as valuable as that of her white counterparts in a particular space. So due to the covertness of the structural injustice in shaping the epistemic praxis of the community, she finds herself in an ambivalent or confused or doubtful or dubious situation, I guess, towards her capacity as an epistemic peer, believing that something may actually be lacking in her epistemic abilities. So here, what I'm trying to explain is that the structural injustice is pervasively and covertly ingrained in the epistemic community, such that the perceptions produced by epistemic injustice about one's status as a knower can insidiously appear to be relevant insights about one's epistemic abilities, and not merely erroneous and baseless claims about one's epistemic capacity. So the key considerations that I want to add here for your consciousness is that the agent doesn't necessarily even have to be aware of the pervasiveness of the structural injustice. The agent may not even be able to see that they're experiencing epistemic injustice because of the covertness and the ingrained nature of the epistemic injustice in doing the very business and the practices of the epistemic environment. So with the prevalence of encounters and experiences of epistemic injustice in the epistemic community, the epistemic agent finds herself engulfed with covertly prejudiced claims, which appear to her as relevant evaluative claims about her epistemic standing and undermine the perception that she may have of herself as an epistemic peer in that community. Put differently, the prevalence of interactive and structural injustice creates conditions of interactive and structural epistemic gaslighting, which, if successful, make one feel justified in their belief that they're inadequate, resulting in imposterism. Final note, when a person is being gaslighted, she is essentially set up to lose trust and doubt her capacity to perceive, judge, and reflect on information in a manner that is adequately reflective of reality. So we see that gaslighting from covert instances of injustice manufactures evidence against one's adequacy, which directly results in the victim discounting their own judgments of their capacity as an epistemic peer. Just to speak on the indiscernibility of the evidence, there is something about the covert operation of that epistemic injustice that makes one think that maybe I am the problem, right? Particularly given that the epistemically unjust claims made against the individual implicate their status as a knower and appear to be relevant evaluations of one's capacity as a knower. And where the operations of the structural injustice in the epistemic community remain covert and ingrained in the practice of the epistemic community, exclusion from the epistemic community has the appearance of being warranted because it is articulated to the agent in epistemic terms. As such, one is put in a scenario where the evidence produced by the epistemic community, which is a product of the epistemic injustice, is essentially indistinguishable from what would otherwise be real evidence against the epistemic capability. And when the epistemic injustice is ingrained in the epistemic praxis, it becomes difficult to discern, as Corley has told us, whether feedback one gets on their capacity as epistemic peers is on account of the epistemic injustice or is in actuality a fair evaluation of their capacity. So what we're seeing here, of course, is an instance where an individual has fertile grounds to mistrust and to have doubts about their ability that are caused by the epistemic injustice that they encounter. Thank you so much.